So welcome to This Cycling Life. Today I'm joined by Vicki Nicholson, an accomplished master cyclist. Vicki, originally from Ireland, has spent a big part of her life living in India and recently returned to Dublin. What we're going to do today is talk about Vicki's experience in juggling the three balls, of course, of career, her relationships, her commitments, and of course her work, and how she's been able to do that, and not only do that, but also manage to compete in two UCI Gran Fondo World Championships. So, Vicki, welcome to you. I'd love to start out by asking you, how did you first get into cycling?
About 10 or 11 years ago, I was living in India. I was a keen horse rider and yogi. And my boyfriend, now husband, was into running and cycling. And I went to see him off on something called the Tour of Nilgiris. And I was quite taken back, actually, at the time. I didn't realize there was any kind of cycling scene in India. And there were all these lycra-clad people heading off for a week in the mountains. And I was quite intrigued. So I went off to, this was over Christmas or coming up to Christmas, I went off to Sri Lanka for a week of yoga while he was doing that. And when I came back, he bought me a hybrid bicycle. So I started riding that with the local group and had a bit of fun with it and thought, okay, maybe I can do a bit more of this.
Yeah. But not only do a bit more, I mean, I think you really got into it. I mean, it became a passion for you and eventually going on to train and compete. Can you talk to us a little bit about that journey of really starting out as a complete beginner and then getting into more structured training and then eventually on to competition and eventually the world championship level?
Yeah, it was quite a journey. I think, well, the first thing was I was looking for some way to sort of ramp up my fitness, and cycling worked for me. I think I found a great community right from the start. In India, the cycling scene is small, but it's also very close. And I think quite open and easy to get into. So I found, a group of cyclists, all actually men at the time, but they were prepared to slow down a bit for me and teach me some of the rules of the game and look after me a bit. And yeah, I just loved it. I love getting out on the weekends. I think when you live in a really crowded city, just being able to get on the bike and get out into the countryside. And then just the general camaraderie of the friendships and of course, also, being a bit of a sort of type A personality, I liked pushing myself to the limits and testing myself a bit. And then, of course, it was a small scene, so I had a lot of early success. Honestly, there was limited competition in women's cycling there. So, but of course, that's encouraging. So I think all of those things got me off to a good start, and I just sort of carried on from there.
And can you talk about your first experience of racing internationally? I mean, what drove that desire to, leave the local club in India, the local level of competition, and then step up to a much higher level of competition and rivalry?
Yeah, I was quite inspired by a friend called Rajesh Nair, and he was competing in some of these UCI qualifiers. And I sort of looked at what he was doing and I thought, okay, that sounds interesting. Maybe give it a go. So there was a qualifier happening in Dubai. This was in 2015. It wasn't too far to go. Seemed like a bit of an adventure. So off I went. And my husband came along with me. We spent a week there, had a great time, met a lot of people, crashed during the race. Ironically, I finished second in the race, and the woman who finished first and in my age category, she crashed, and then I was right behind her, so I crashed on top of her, but we both got up back on our bikes, lost the bunch at that stage, but managed to finish together. And yeah, we still finished first and second and both qualified, so...
That's great. And I guess, I mean, for those people watching who haven't competed in the at the UCI World Series level before, I mean, it is quite unique in that we have these age group classifications, and every 5 years, essentially, you go up to the next age group. How old were you when you actually sort of started competing at this level? And, were you at the tail end of your 5-year age group? Were you one of the young ones? How was that for you?
Yeah, so I was in the 50 to 54 age category. I think just sort of a couple of years into that. That's a pretty competitive category, actually, especially when you step up to the finals level. I think in the Asian qualifiers, it's very random. It just depends who shows up. But once you get into that sort of final level, that's a pretty competitive level of women, because I think anyone who's still doing it at that stage, they're pretty decent at it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's
It's
pretty much in the middle at that point.
it's actually interesting that you say that, because one of the things that I discovered myself as a masters athlete, I'd been racing the 40 to 45 category, then I went up to the 45 to 50. And even racing here in Belgium, what I discovered, and actually just looked at the data to prove it, was that often that slightly higher age group category, the level was even higher. The race speeds were higher. And, I got curious about that. But then, of course, I started to realize that for many of those people who are under the age of, say, 45, many of them still have young children. They're really in the middle of their career. Whereas when you get towards late 40s and 50s, many people who have children, they're getting into their teens, they're older, or maybe they're more established in their careers and they decide to channel their energy into a new direction. But certainly that level of competition doesn't seem to go down. Certainly the average
Oh.
speeds don't seem to go down at that point. And what sort of training were you doing? I mean, because also I imagine living in Bangalore, it's quite a special city in terms of just getting access to train and getting out on the roads. And so
Yeah,
when in 2015, and again, you went on in 2017 to race the World Championships in Albi in France.
yeah.
How were you juggling that in terms of the work and the training and getting in enough training to be in shape to race? How long was the distance?
That's a good question. I think it was around about in Oldbar. I think it was around about 95,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Okay.
But there
So
was a massive wind, so it felt like a lot more. And then, of course, in Albi, it was kind of hilly, and hot.
mm,
So they were both tough courses. I had a coach. I got access to a Training Peaks coach, which just came through support in India. That helped a lot, because I think you need the structure so that when you are training, you're using the time the right way. I used to train a lot on the indoor trainer during the week, because I didn't really have the time to sort of get out. And then weekends, I would do longer rides and with the team, which was also great, because I was doing a lot of group riding and having to push myself quite a bit, to stay up, to sort of stay on with the group. But really having a training plan and having a coach who knew, introduced me to power, the whole notion of FTPs and, training to a certain power ratio. I think all of that was really important.
mhm. And when you did identify a coach to work with, how did you find that experience in terms of your coach working with you as a woman, and particularly as a woman who was in her 50s? I mean, was that something new for your coach? Did your coach have experience and an
Mhm.
understanding of, how your physiology, your needs were different perhaps to a male athlete or a younger athlete?
Yeah, so I picked a woman in her 60s.
Mm.
So,
Great.
and she'd done a lot of endurance. She'd competed in the race across America. She'd also been a good crit rider. So yeah, she was perfect for me, because she was probably 10 years so older than me, knew exactly what it was like to be a woman in her early 50s getting into racing. And we also just had a great connection, because I think the other thing is she always left me leaving a conversation feeling more motivated.
Mm. Yeah. I guess that's a really important aspect of coaching that many people take for granted, and I certainly experienced it with my coach Alan Davis. Is that it's not just about them understanding your physiology, your body, the number of hours you have training, but it's also when you do get that chemistry and that understanding. What I find in myself is that. Having someone watching me, and I'm not saying like Big Brother or something like that, but knowing that Alan is watching the efforts that I do and the hours that I put in, it is an incentive for me, because I want to please him. Actually, I want to show to him that I'm really passionate and serious about what I do. To what extent was that also part of it for you, working with your coach, that this lady inspired you, but was there an extent that you also wanted to show her something, or
Oh,
give something back to
absolutely.
her investment?
Yeah, it was great to sort of show good numbers on the workout and see progression. The other thing I think I got from it was just the headspace of somebody else coming up with your training plan, because, because of work and because I'm also a coach and I do a lot of sort of thinking around those things for other people. I just loved sort of handing that over, and I would just get a plan and not have to angst about, oh, should I be doing more of this or should I be doing less of that? I had someone else to help me with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. And I think also, when you're busy and you're dealing with, in my case, the job and family and everything, just taking that little bit of pressure off yourself in terms of thinking it all through. But to what extent do you think that also takes trust? Because, one of the things I discovered in working with my coach, Alan Davis, was that early on I thought, gee, he's not giving me enough, or he's not pushing me hard enough. But he actually really understood the importance of rest and recovery. And what I started to realize after working with him for a little while was that perhaps I was in the past pushing myself too hard or overdoing the intensity. Was there anything that sort of you really learned or that you discovered that might have been unexpected for you in that coaching relationship?
Yeah, I think overtraining is probably I've read so much at professional level about them making that mistake. And I think it's equally so with amateurs as well. So not falling into that trap. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the kind of stubbornness that pushes you to keep going when you're in pain that is also your worst enemy in terms of not listening to the body when it needs a rest. So it's I think navigating between those two extremes, and a coach is really helpful with that.
And another thing, I guess, because I've also had the pleasure of racing in India. I've done the tour of Nilgiris a couple of times and have some good connections with the Bangalore cycling community. Great bunch of people. But one of the things that I talked to the guys about that I raced with in Nilgiris, those who had done some international competitions, was that shock of kind of racing in a massive peloton with a big group of people, because in many of the races in India, there were smaller groups. How did you find that shift of going from racing in relatively small groups to riding in a peloton of a couple of hundred people often at these world level events?
Yeah, well, the good thing was they were all women, because I was racing a lot in a peloton that was in India that was primarily male. And also the standard of riding is high at a world championship final level. So I actually enjoyed it. When I went for the qualifiers, I qualified in Bintan a couple of times as well. And it wasn't a super big women's peloton, but it was full of women who really knew what they were doing. So I actually really enjoyed that experience. And the communication was really good. Stepping up then to world championship level, the finals, it was a bigger group. That's always a little bit scarier. Generally it was just always such a thrill to be able to ride with a whole bunch of women. As I said, I just didn't get that a lot in India.
And what was different about that experience? I mean, besides, as you mentioned, racing with women who really are talented and skilled in terms of I guess what you're talking about there is the technical handling of their bikes. I mean, were there other aspects of the women's cycling community at that level that
I think there was sort of good sense of communication between people, and of course, you're competing, as you said earlier, against the people in your age category, but you're not all competing against each other. So there's also a lot of sense of keeping an eye on each other and looking after each other. So I enjoyed that. And interestingly enough, they did send in the finals, we got sent off in, I think, 3 different groups, depending on age. But our group in Alby did the fastest time. So that the 50 to 54 women actually got the fastest time on the course of all the women. So that was quite an eye-opener because, not far into the race, I realized that I wasn't going to be in the front bunch for very long. Mm-hmm. But again, very inspiring. Very inspiring to look around me and see women in their 60s racing that hard and that strong. I love that exposure.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible experience, and I think as you've just alluded to, actually, that many people, I guess, take for granted the level of athleticism and performance actually at this level. You know, and I've looked at some of the data of some of the top women's master cyclists, and certainly looking at my peers. You know, I'm racing now 50 plus, but you know, many of these people who are competing at that very elite level at this age group, their power numbers, their physiological performance is pretty similar to what you would see at, say, the pro continental level, you know, in the younger ranks. So, you know, to be at the top at that world level as a masters athlete, actually the physiological, you know, performance that's required is not all that different as what you would see with many people who are 25, 30 years younger. So I agree with you. Vicki, I wonder how also, you know, given your experience, because you did come to cycling relatively late, you had been, of course, always interested in health and well-being with your yoga, but you know, you had been working in this area of leadership development and team effectiveness. I mean, to what extent do you see parallels between what you've learned about performing at a high level on the bike and what you see in business, you know, in terms of whether it's self-belief or work ethic? To what extent do you see parallels or overlap between the two?
Oh, a lot, I think. Yeah. Yeah, there's so much about succeeding in a leadership role that you can align to being a successful athlete. You know, whether it's about sort of, yeah, self-belief in just going after a big dream or a big vision. And I think that piece of putting yourself into situations where you're a bit out of your depth, but, you know, having the confidence that you'll find a way through. And I, you know, I often felt that in racing, that, you know, I was really throwing myself into something that I had no idea how it's going to come out the other side. But I think that's also when you're leading a team or leading an organization, at times you need to have that kind of courage to step up. So, and then the communication piece, you know, riding in a team, we know cycling in a team, it's all about looking out for each other. It's all about, you know, when you ride a team time trial, the way you communicate with each other, the sort of rapport and connection that you have. So all of that translates to the way you work in a team and business as well.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned earlier you crashed. I mean, you crashed in a competition level race, and I'm sure you've had other crashes in your cycling career. But when that did happen to you, I mean, when you have crashed your bike and it hurts, I mean, how have you been able to sort of rebuild the confidence to get back up again and continue? And I guess that's also part of leadership, right? It's also part of business that we get knocked down, we have setbacks, but how did you experience that? Because, you know, some people often crash down and they lose confidence or they lose their nerve and find it a struggle.
Yeah. I think probably more fueled by just my love of being on the bike than anything else. So wanting to get back quickly on the bike. I mean, I was pretty lucky in Dubai. It was just scrapes and bruises. So there was nothing that, you know, I couldn't start riding. I mean, you know, I went out running the day after the race, so I was fine. I took part in Rosnamorn, which is one of the big women's races in Ireland. And I broke my collarbone in that race. So that was a little trickier. That was a little harder to come back from. And there I took a decision to put a pin in my collarbone just so I could heal faster and get back on the bike quicker. I think as an older athlete, you are always a bit conscious of time ticking by and how many years do you want to race for? You don't really know the answer to that question, but you don't want to leave, you know, too long a time off the bike. And the other thing is, as you're older, it's harder to get back to fitness as well. So I think that drive that, you know, that overcame anything about, you know, sort of fear of crashing again.
Yeah, yeah. I think I can empathize with you. You see, I'm not sure if you can see. I'll show you this. You see this. I have this steel reinforced collarbone as well. The only problem is, you see, there's a bit of a bump here.
Yeah.
My doctor informed me last year that I now have a screw loose.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Right.
people have been telling me that for quite some time, as you can, as you can probably imagine. But now it's literal. So yeah, that's special. But it's good to hear. I mean, the other thing I guess here is it is about longevity, isn't it? Because I mean, you're still a young woman. You still have another, I don't know, 30, potentially 40 years of cycling ahead of you. How do you think about that? How do you think about your cycling future and goals? And you know, is there a bucket list for you?
Well, I do think about, yeah, the longevity piece. So in terms of Am I doing the right things right now to be able to continue to be sort of fit and healthy in, 20 years time? So that's certainly a piece on my mind. I do wonder about racing, Grand Fondo finals. I don't know if I'll do that again. It does take a lot of time and commitment. I enjoy the format now of something like Giro del Dolomiti, where you go out for 6 days. It's a big challenge, but it's not pure racing. It's a segment of each day you race, and the rest of it you ride at a sort of easier pace. But it's super challenging because you're climbing very big mountains and you've got to stay in a peloton of fit riders. But it doesn't have the intensity of full-on one-day racing. And the likelihood of crashing, though I've managed to crash in Dolomiti as well, so you can crash, but the likelihood is less. So I don't know exactly what my goals will be. Right now, we're kind of all off racing anyway. I have to see. I know that definitely, though, I want to keep doing the sort of longer, bigger challenges up mountains. But whether I want to race another Grand Fondo, I'll see how things go.
Well, you should definitely have a look at our recent interview with Alan Colville, who is another Irishman, by the way. And he broke the Guinness world records for the most altitude meters climbed in 48 hours for the men. So if you like climbing mountains and you like doing that at your pace, then maybe that's something for the bucket list. But a terrific interview. Look, I guess my last question, Vicki, I'm really curious about this one, is that you've spent so many years of your career, working in leadership development, working in organizational performance. To what extent do you see a connect between, health, well-being, and performance in business? Because, many people think that, well, the brain, it's above the shoulders and, it's all about what happens up here. But what's your take on that?
I believe hugely that there's a connection. I think in emotional, mental, physical, spiritual, I think all of those facets combine. So I think taking care of the body is going to give you so much more resilience mentally. And so much more probably intellectual horsepower, and even more importantly, emotional resilience. Because I would suggest that as you take on big roles in leadership, it's so much about your ability to sort of deal with pressure and whatever's thrown at you, and keep composure, be able to inspire people through difficult times. And I think if you're fit physically, that just comes much, much easier.
Great. Wonderful. I couldn't agree with you more, Vicki. I mean, it's certainly been a discovery for me. I spent a big part of my career as a knowledge worker. But actually, having got on my bike now almost for 10 years, I've absolutely started to understand that, many of my best ideas, my ability to cope with stress and to deal with complexity, so much of that is helped by what we do on the bike. So, Vicki, this has been a fascinating conversation. It's been wonderful to have you on This Cycling Live. For those people who've been watching, if you have enjoyed the interview, please do give us the thumbs up. And of course, please do slam that subscribe button. So, Vicki Nicholson, thank you very much again for joining us on This Cycling Live.
Thanks, Jamie.